This is at the 10th night together. As always, pause just a moment to like, subscribe, and share this series with someone who sleeps better among stories. Now, hush, sink in. Let the flickering past wash gently over your imagination. In this final chapter of our Celtic World series, we trace the last echoes of a civilization wrapped in magic, mystery, and moonlight. Episode 10 begins now. In this lecture, I will transition from focusing on the Celts themselves to the ways in which Celtic heritage was rediscovered by scholars and reappropriated by people in the Celtic areas who believed that connecting with the Celtic past had meaning for them in the present. Modern notions of Celtic nationalism all derive from this scholarly tradition that began in the 16th century. There is some irony involved in this story, and the Celtic traditions are not strangers to irony. Just as Ireland was being finally conquered by the English, and the Jacobite rebellions were leading to a decline in traditional Gaelic culture in the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, scholars were uncovering the relationships between the Celtic languages, and several important translations of supposedly ancient Celtic texts took the European literary world by storm. The Celtic phenomenon thus became wildly popular among non-Celtic speakers only after any conceivable military threat from actual Celts had largely disappeared. In this lecture, I will range very widely over the Celtic world, including a brief discussion of Ireland, but mostly focusing on Scotland and Wales. The story of the intersection between scholarship and the Celts begins in the late 16th century with a Scottish scholar named George Buchanan. He was the first to discover the linguistic relationship among the Celtic languages and to popularize the notion of a Celtic race. Buchanan had a colorful career. He briefly tutored the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots in Latin, but during Mary's reign, he converted to Presbyterianism. And after Mary was driven into exile, Buchanan became one of the tutors to the young James VI, who loathed Buchanan for lecturing him constantly about the limitations of the rights of kings and for making sure his royal charge got regular beatings. Buchanan was also instrumental in implicating the exiled queen in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. So his political track record was interesting, to say the least. But for our purposes, it is Buchanan the scholar we need to focus on, not Buchanan the politician. A native speaker of Scottish Gaelic, as the word is pronounced in Scotland, Buchanan was also a phenomenally talented linguist who wrote prolifically in both Latin and Scots, the form of English spoken in Scotland. He was in fact a leading light of the European Renaissance. And here is where the two main parts of his intellectual makeup met. He had learned in his youth some of the more fanciful stories about where the Irish and the Scots had come from. That is, the traditions embodied in the Irish Book of Invasions, which had also been carried over into the Scottish traditions. This tradition traced the origins of the Scots and the Irish to Scythia in Central Asia, and even in some versions to Troy. But being a skeptical Renaissance man, Buchanan did not believe them. So Buchanan decided to investigate the origins of the Scots, and by extension the Irish, on his own terms. To do this, he invented a scholarly methodology, which was to investigate similarities in language and religion, and especially place names among several different peoples. He identified place names with common elements, such as the lull prefix that we see in places all over Europe, and that probably indicates a common cult of the god Lull. This kind of evidence helped Buchanan piece together the theory that the Celtic speakers of the British Isles were related to the Celtic speakers of continental Europe. He didn't get everything right. Although he believed the Picts were similar in language to the Celts, he saw the Picts as coming from Scythia, perhaps as a way of trying to rescue some part of the older tradition. Now we know that this is totally wrong. But the biggest contribution Buchanan made was clearly to make a connection between Britain and the continent, and to say, these are all Celts, they are one people. and this gave the Celtic speakers of Scotland a kind of classical credibility that was rather important in an age when the Celtic languages were under assault. Suddenly, Buchanan's fellow Celts were related to the people who had almost successfully defied Julius Caesar. Ironically, Buchanan's work on the origins of the Scots brought the stories of the Book of Invasions back into the headlines, so to speak. Because Buchanan was a major figure, his study of the Celts was widely read, and it prompted another extremely important intellectual, the English poet Sir Edmund Spenser, to weigh in on the question of the origins of the Irish. The reason is that Spenser spent several decades in the 1580s and 90s as a colonial administrator in Ireland, and he was actually driven from Ireland by rebels during the 9 Years' War in the 1590s, and in response, he wrote a blistering attack on Irish culture. One of the points he wanted to refute strongly was the connection that is made in the Book of Invasions between Ireland and Spain. It's not a mystery why this would be controversial in the 1590s. The English had just defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, but Spain had responded to this defeat by making an alliance with the Irish rebels. So it was a good time to try to squelch any thought that there might be any sort of kinship between the Spanish and the Irish. But if people like George Buchanan and Sir Edmund Spenser were attacking the traditions embodied in the Book of Invasions, there were also scholars who passionately defended the historical value of these traditions, including an Irish Catholic priest named Shacharun Caton, known more commonly under his English name as Geoffrey Keating. Keating was from an Old English family, that is, a family that derived its descent from English settlers that had stayed Catholic, and he had obviously adopted an Irish cultural identity, though he remained loyal to the Stuart dynasty. He was also a product of the main intellectual currents in the late Renaissance, having studied at the Irish College in Bordeaux in France, which had been set up in the early 17th century to educate Irish Catholics, whose religion barred them from studying in English or Irish universities. Keating became fascinated by Irish history, and in 1634 he completed a book entitled Foras Fasciaut Éireann, or The Foundation of Knowledge on Ireland. He could not print the book because it was explicitly pro-Catholic, but it did circulate in manuscript, and Keating's learned status helped to keep belief in the semi-legendary traditions of early Irish history alive well into the 18th century and beyond. The real scholarly progress on Celtic linguistics, though, was going to take place not in Ireland, but in the Brittonic world about 100 years later, with the work of a French scholar named Paul-Yves Pézeran, who lived from 1639 to 1706. Pézeran was a Cistercian monk from Brittany, so he was familiar with the Breton language. In 1703, he published a book entitled Antiquité de la Nation et de la Langue Celte autrement appelée Gaulois, which was translated into English 3 years later as The Antiquities of Nations, more particularly of the Celtae, or Gauls. Pézeran is best known for coining the term Celtic language, and he saw similarities between the Celtic languages and Greek and Latin. Basically, Pézeran was reaching toward the methodology of comparative linguistics. He believed Breton was the last remnant of Gaulish, which he thought was derived from a language spoken at the time of the Tower of Babel. This was not exactly right, of course, since Breton was actually the speech of the immigrants from Britain who had arrived in Brittany in the 5th century, but he was at least in the right ballpark. And in fact, one of his most important contributions was to identify the connection between Breton and Welsh, and from now on, the Welsh, too, were seen to be Celts. And when Pézeran's work was translated into English, it was in fact a Welshman who picked up the ball and ran with it. Edward Llwyd, who lived from 1660 to 1709, was the curator of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, and he ran in exalted intellectual circles. He was a friend of Sir Isaac Newton. Llwyd was very aware of what was going on in the field of early Celtic studies, and he was a great admirer of Peshalm. Fluid compared vocabulary words from Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Cornish, and Breton, and his great contribution was to bring all the Celtic languages together for the first time. It's interesting that he personally did not want to use the term Celtic for the languages of the British Isles and Ireland, but he did see the relationships between them, and he made a crucial discovery. Fluid was the first to recognize the sound changes between Welsh and Irish. That is, the distinction between Q Celtic and P Celtic we discussed in earlier lectures. Fluid also invented the terms Goidelic and Brittonic for the speakers of Q Celtic and P Celtic, respectively, and he named them after characters in the Book of Invasions. So by the early 18th century, scholars had made huge strides in recognizing the kinship between the Celtic languages and also how they should be classified with regard to each other. Up until this point, nobody really knew that the Irish and the Welsh had anything in common other than hating the English. This scholarly work on the Celtic languages crossed over into popular culture in the 18th century in a huge way, partly driven by current events. And this is when I need to do a brief digression into the story of the Jacobites. The Jacobites were, of course, the fanatical romantic faction that supported the exiled Stuart family, the descendants of James VII of Scotland and II of England, who had been driven from both the English and Scottish thrones in 1688 for being completely incompetent and gratuitously offensive to their subjects. The Jacobites get their name from the name Jacobus, which is simply the Latin form of James. A brief spoiler alert, the Jacobites ultimately lost. But between 1689 and 1745, there was a whole series of attempts, some of them more well-developed than others, to restore the Stuarts to the British throne. The last attempt ended in April 1746 with the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Culloden of James II's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. The British commander, the Duke of Cumberland, younger son of King George II, became known for his savage reprisals against the Jacobites as the Butcher of Culloden. And by the way, this nickname was given to him by his own brother. The British government's reaction to the Jacobite Rising of 1745 had very important ramifications for the story of the Celts. Let's go back for a moment to the Battle of Culloden. This battle is often popularly believed to have been a clash between Highlanders on the Jacobite side and Lowlanders and Englishmen on the government side, and this is emphatically not the case. There were speakers of Scottish Gaelic on both sides of the conflict. There is some beautiful Gaelic poetry that mourns the death of the Jacobite soldiers. But on the other hand, one of the most intriguing artifacts that was retrieved from the battlefield was a Gaelic Bible that belonged to a soldier loyal to King George. But the British government did not see the situation with this kind of nuance. Instead, they associated all Highlanders with rebels, and they decided to carry out the kind of Anglicizing policy that had been pursued in Ireland at the time of the Tudor conquest there. Let's try to get these people to look and act more like Englishmen, or at least Lowland Scots. So in 1746, the British passed the Dress Act of 1746, which banned the use of tartan, the distinctive multicolored checked cloth worn in the Highlands, except that Scottish regiments could use it within the British Army. Now, the idea behind banning tartan was clearly to undermine the solidarity of the Highland clans and also to try to assimilate the Highlanders into lowland culture. There's an interesting parallel here to the efforts made by the English in Ireland to get the Irish to dress in the English manner. The Dress Act was widely resented, and in fact, it ended up creating a kind of radical tartan chic. But let's back up and do a quick history of tartan and why it matters. Its origins are obscure. Tartan-like textiles were produced in the 8th to the 6th centuries BC in the Hallstatt culture in Central Europe, and remains of such textiles were actually discovered in 2004 But since we also see similar patterns in Western China, it's hard to say how distinctive they are, much less to make a direct connection between, say, Hallstatt and Scotland. The earliest surviving fragment of a British tartan dates to the 3rd century AD from a pot found at Falkirk in Stirlingshire, which is just north of the Antonine Wall. It was found in a pot with 2,000 Roman coins. But tartan was also used in Jutland in Denmark around the same time. But then we have a hiatus where it's not mentioned. We just don't have any evidence about it. Tartan, as we think of it, next appears in the 16th century, when we suddenly find lots of references in written sources to striped or checked plaids. And by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, standardized forms had developed. A Gallic-speaking scholar with the rather unprepossessing name of Martin Martin wrote a book in 1703 called A Description of the Western Islands of Scotland. In this book, he noted that the different islands and regions had their own patterns of tartan, and this is just how the weavers in that area happened to produce the cloth, based on what local dyes were available. But note that this is a regional thing, not a clan thing. There would be some overlap, of course, between region and clan, but nobody is yet claiming that there is a Campbell tartan or a MacDonald tartan, and you might have had MacDonalds who lived in different valleys wearing different tartans. The one place where tartans really are standardized, ironically, was in the British Army. A group of Highlanders could be a riotously colorful bunch, so there was a drive to standardize their tartans by regiment. And ironically, this standardization within the British Army may have ultimately led to the idea of clan tartans, about which I'll say more shortly. But of course, by forbidding the wearing of tartan for civilians in 1746, the English were almost inevitably creating a mystique around tartan, and the odd effect seems to have been to expand the meaning of tartan from a marker of Highland or Gallic identity to a marker of Scottish identity writ large. And tartan was not the only Celtic phenomenon that was controversial in the 18th century. I want to talk now about one of the most famous literary debates of all time. It concerns a series of poems published beginning in 1760 by the Scottish poet James Macpherson, who claimed that these poems were translations from an ancient book written in Gaelic. The poems drew on tales familiar from Irish tradition, such as the stories from the Finn cycle about the great hero Finn McCool and his son Oisin, who travels across the sea to the other world with his fairy lover, only to return and discover that 300 years have passed in Ireland in what seemed to him the blink of an eye. Oisin is cast as the bardic narrator of the poems, and they also include references to the Ulster cycle stories about the hero Cuchulainn. Now let me give you a sample of what this text sounds like. Cuchulainn sat by Torah's wall, he spoke like a wave on a rock, who in this land appears like me. Heroes stand not in my presence, they fall to earth from my hand. Who can meet Swaran in fight? Who but Fingal, king of Selma of storms? Once we wrestled on Malmore, our heels overturned the woods, rocks fell from their place, rivulets changing their course, fled murmuring from our side. 3 days we renewed the strife, heroes stood at a distance, untrembled. I think Macpherson is probably capturing an 18th century sensibility rather than that of the ancient bards, but he did his job supremely well. These poems were hugely popular. They were translated into all the major European languages, and they had a huge influence on Romanticism. Napoleon supposedly loved the poems, and they inspired works of art and music, such as Felix Mendelssohn's overture entitled Fingal's Cave, named for a natural rock formation in the Inner Hebrides that received this name in tribute to Macpherson's poems. But if the general public fell hard for Oisin, who was proclaimed in some quarters the Celtic equivalent of Homer, some members of the literary establishment began to raise questions right away. First, Irish people were angry that these texts were claimed for Scotland. But more seriously, doubts were raised about the authenticity of the poems. Where were the original texts on which these so-called translations were based? Macpherson never produced them. Samuel Johnson, the famous compiler of the first real English dictionary, said Macpherson was a mountebank, a liar, and a fraud, and that the poems were forgeries. He was asked, "But Dr. Johnson, do you really believe that any man today could write such poetry?" He replied, "Yes, many men, many women, and many children." Of course, Johnson hated Gaelic, which he called the rude speech of a barbarous people. But others leapt to Macpherson's defense. Scottish author Hugh Blair's defense in 1763 was included in every edition of the poems thereafter. But Irish author Charles O'Connor said it was a forgery, and the controversy continued into the early 19th century and beyond. These days, the modern scholarly consensus is that Macpherson probably really did draw on original sources, but they were mostly oral. He gathered lots of ballads that contained traditional stories, many of which drew on traditions that were common to both Ireland and Scotland. And then he created a kind of fake bardic epic with a lot of Macpherson-esque touches. Ironically, some of the stories have since been discovered in medieval Scottish manuscripts that Macpherson probably didn't have access to. So, the Oisin hoax, if we can call it that, ends up demonstrating that the tradition on which he drew was pretty authentic after all. He really only got himself in trouble because he went a little too far in claiming that he had one written source, and that these poems were all the work of Oisin himself. It's a bit similar to how Geoffrey of Monmouth, in the 12th century, took a bunch of tales about King Arthur and claimed that he found them in a single manuscript in the British language. Both Macpherson and Geoffrey of Monmouth wanted the credibility that came with having a written source, and both authors have been controversial ever since. They should have just copped to it and used footnotes. But the Oisin craze helped to drive a renewed fascination with all things Scottish. In 1778, the Highland Society was founded in London so that expatriate Scots could get together and talk about Scottish culture. And note that this was specifically related to Highland culture, that is, the Gaelic-speaking areas, though the language of the society in London was definitely English. The profile of Scottish culture was raised even higher in 1782 when lobbying efforts by a Scottish nobleman led to the repeal of the Highland Dress Act. By that time, it was fairly clear that the Jacobites were no longer a threat. Bonnie Prince Charlie, now in exile on the continent, was a rather less dashing 62-year-old with no legitimate heirs, and his younger brother was a Catholic cardinal, and hence precluded from taking the English throne. And by now, Highland regiments, dressed in their distinctive tartan, had demonstrated their valor on many British imperial battlefields around the world. So tartan became less associated with rebellion and more with valiant military service. Upon the repeal of the Act, the following address was offered in English and Gaelic. "Listen, men, this is bringing before all the sons of the Gael. The King and Parliament of Britain have forever abolished the Act against the Highland dress, which came down to the clans from the beginning of the world to the year 1746. This must bring great joy to every Highland heart. You are no longer bound down to the unmanly dress of the Lowlander. This is declaring to every man, young and old, simple and gentle, that they may after this put on and wear the trews, the little kilt, the coat, and the striped hose, as also the belted plaid, without fear of the law of the realm, or the spite of the enemies." So far, so good. But now we get a fascinating twist to the story. So far, tartans were, as I've said, a local thing. You wore the tartan of your locality. But after this 36-year hiatus where these local traditions were abrogated, we get this period of tartan revival and Highland chic. And now tartans get associated with particular clans. These are supposedly ancient associations, but they're really not. But the Highland Society of London in 1815 mandated tartans for each clan. Note, though, that an organization in London is now presuming to tell Scottish clans what their proper tartans should be. But even if we concede that the concept of the clan tartan is a bit artificial, it has turned out to be a stroke of marketing genius, and the person who takes a huge amount of the credit is, ironically, a lowland Scot who spoke no Gaelic, the famous Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott. In 1820, he founded the Celtic Society of Edinburgh, which put on a huge festival in 1822. Scots were urged to come, all plaided and plumed in their tartan array. As I said, Scott was a lowlander. His ancestors had for sure never worn tartan, but somehow the tartan had now become associated with Scottishness in general, as opposed to Highland Scottishness in particular. And the tartan phenomenon got a huge boost when King George IV visited the festival in 1822 and appeared fully outfitted in royal Stuart tartan. Contemporary satirists made great hay of the elderly and rather corpulent Hanoverian king dressed up in tartan finery, but most regarded the king's outfit, the way he intended it, as a sincere effort to flatter his Scottish subjects. Still, not all Scots were on board with the rise of tartan. The most famous tartan skeptic is the Victorian historian Lord Macaulay, who rather pointedly noted that before the Jacobite Rising, tartan dress was looked down on by lowlanders who tended to see Highlanders as uncivilized and even criminal. Macaulay referred to King George's visit as follows: "The last British king who held a court in Holyrood," that's Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, "thought that he could not give a more striking proof of his respect for the usages which had prevailed in Scotland before the Union than by disguising himself in what, before the Union, was considered by 9 Scotchmen out of 10 as the dress of a thief." But the fact is that opinions on Scotland had dramatically changed. Tartan was now in, and it still is. After King George's visit, it was de rigueur for members of the royal family to wear tartan in Scotland. Even for Queen Victoria's very German consort, Prince Albert, not exactly a Celt. In less than a century, tartan had gone from the dress of a hated pack of rebels to the national dress of Scotland. This was some pretty powerful rebranding. Now, some people are disillusioned when they learn that clan tartans are not a very ancient tradition. But here's how I see it. By now, it's a 200-year-old myth, which is ancient enough for me. So go, buy your clan tartan, wear it in good health. My Scottish relatives came from Berwickshire, which is just barely over the border from England, so not the Highlands. And I still love my supposed family tartan. Why not? At the same time that Scottish culture was tending in a decidedly Celtic direction, a Celtic revival was underway in Wales as well. It began in the mid-18th century with a renewed fascination with the Druids, which had ironically been touched off first by an English vicar named William Stukeley. He first proposed the idea that the Druids had worshipped in stone monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, which we now know is not true. A much earlier German writer had already suggested that Druids wore white robes. We have no evidence for this whatsoever, and the idea stuck. The Druid craze spread to Wales, and the first Druidic society was founded on the Welsh island of Anglesey in 1772. This was at least correct. Anglesey really was a stronghold of Druidism at the time of the Romans. At the same time as the Druids were getting going again, there was a serious effort to revive the old traditions of the Welsh bards. Way back in 1176, a powerful Welsh ruler called the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth had held a poetry competition at his court at Cardigan. Such an event was called an Eisteddfod, which in Welsh just means session. These competitions continued during the Middle Ages, but they fell into abeyance in the 17th century. Then they were revived in 1789 when Thomas Jones created an event that was opened to the public for the first time. The most famous figure in the Welsh revival was Iolo Morgannwg, who was interested in both poetry and druids. His real name was a lot less exotic sounding. He was called Edward Williams. In 1792, Morgannwg founded the Gorsedd Verd Ynys Prydain, an organization for the bards of the island of Britain, to put the revived Eisteddfod on a sound footing. The interesting thing to note here is that this organization first met in London, just like the Highland Society. In fact, Morgannwg had only really gotten interested in Welsh matters when he went to London and started hanging out with other Welsh people in the Gwenedigion Society, which had been founded in 1770 to bring Welsh people in the capital together. It's ironic that so much of the work of the Celtic revival happened not in the actual Celtic fringe countries, but in the metropolis. Iolo Morgannwg was not just an organizer of Welsh cultural events, he was also an author. And I use the term advisedly, because although Morgannwg claimed to be publishing ancient Welsh texts, he clearly forged a lot of his manuscripts. Iolo was very determined to prove continuity with the ancient druids and ancient bards, and in some cases he went a bit too far. In 1789, he forged poems by the very famous 14th century Welsh poet Dafydd ap Gwilym, whom I discussed in my lecture on medieval Wales. So this is a bit similar to Macpherson forging the poems about Oisin, but it's an even more blatant imposture. Let me hasten to say that the music and poetry on offer at the modern Eisteddfod is not fake in the least. The Eisteddfod continues, and today it is considered one of the key cultural institutions of Wales. If the poetic revival is flourishing, the Druid revival is still alive and well also, but it is divided into two main branches. One strand of Druidism went into an explicitly religious, neo-pagan direction. Around the turn of the 20th century, these neo-pagan Druids began worshipping at Stonehenge, ironically just as archaeologists were determining for sure that Stonehenge was much too old to have been built by actual Druids. But that didn't seem to bother anybody, because they are still doing it. I was once at Stonehenge on June 22nd, right after the summer solstice, with a group of students, and we got to see actual Druids in their white robes. So what if the white robe tradition is only a couple of hundred years old? So that's one branch of the modern Druid movement, but there is another branch that embraces Druidism in a totally non-sectarian way. These are the members of the Ancient Order of Druids, which was founded in London in 1781 as a fraternal organization similar to the Masons. One of my favorite images to illustrate the difference between the two branches of modern Druidism is a picture of a very young Winston Churchill being inaugurated into the Albion Lodge of the Ancient Order of Druids of Oxford at Blenheim Palace, the home of his grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough. So this branch of Druids had clearly gone establishment. The Celtic revival in Scotland and Wales thus contained a fascinating mixture of genuine tradition, well-meaning forgery based on authentic texts, and outright invention. But it is now all authentically part of the modern culture of the Celtic lands. I talked in an earlier lecture about the Celtic revival movement in Wales and Scotland. In this lecture, we're going to continue to look at the Celtic revival, but this time we'll be concentrating specifically on Ireland. In Ireland, the reappropriation of Celtic literature and art was more politically oriented than in Scotland and Wales. There hadn't been serious political unrest in Wales since the late Middle Ages. In Wales, the interest in the Celtic past was mostly confined to the cultural sphere, especially with literature and music, and of course, the Welsh language. The story was slightly different in Scotland because of the later, not entirely accurate association between the Jacobite rebellions and Celtic identity. Still, the question of the political relationship between Scotland and England wasn't a burning issue until the late 20th century. Matters were very different in Ireland. There, the question of Irish and specifically Celtic identity did become broadly political, though this identification with the Irish past manifested itself differently for different people. In order to understand the relationship between the Celtic revival and Irish politics, we need to catch up quickly on Irish political developments in the 19th century, And then we'll look at the 4 areas where Celtic revivalism was most important in Ireland: sports, language, art, and literature. The 19th century in Ireland was dominated by a debate over the future of Ireland's relationship with Britain. In 1798, there was a major rebellion in Ireland led by a group called the United Irishmen, who were an explicitly non-sectarian Republican group. They wanted a democratic government for all of Ireland that was totally separate from Britain. But they really saw themselves as part of an international movement. They were very influenced by both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The leader of the United Irishmen, a man called Theobald Wolfetone, was a Protestant lawyer from Dublin who had spent considerable time in Belfast. The nationalism of the United Irishmen was supposed to transcend religion, and certainly to transcend ethnicity. There was no sense that being an Irish nationalist was confined to people of a certain ethnic heritage or religion. The rebellion of 1798 was seen by the British government as a very serious threat to national security, because it led to French troops landing on Irish soil. And even though these troops were very quickly defeated, the British wanted to be sure that such an invasion never happened again. Until this time, the Irish had had their own parliament, but in 1800, an Act of Union did away with the Irish Parliament and brought Ireland under the direct rule of the British Parliament in London. This was supposed to help with security, and the British government also promised that an all-British Parliament would be in a better position to guarantee the rights of Catholics in Ireland than the local Protestant landlords in Ireland. At the time, many Catholics in Ireland, including the Catholic bishops, backed the Union. Fairly quickly after the passage of the Act of Union, it became clear that the new constitutional arrangement was more beneficial for some groups in Ireland than others. The more heavily industrialized northeast of the country, which had been settled extensively by Protestant Scots and Englishmen in the 17th century, did very well. But the rest of the country, which was more heavily Catholic, failed to see the economic gains they had expected, and disenchantment with the Union only increased due to the catastrophic effects of the Great Famine of the 1840s, when the potato crop failed repeatedly, leading to widespread death from starvation and disease, and massive emigration. Throughout the 19th century, then, there was a lively debate over the best way for Ireland to express its relationship with Britain. There were 3 main strands of opinion. The first was unionism, that is, the belief that the Act of Union was a good thing. Most unionists were Protestants who identified strongly with Britain. There were also 2 strands of nationalist opinion. The less radical one was constitutional nationalism. The constitutional nationalists wanted to see Ireland recover at least some of the political autonomy it had had before the Act of Union, while remaining connected to Britain in some way. There were prominent constitutional nationalists from both the Protestant and Catholic communities. In fact, the 2 most famous Irish politicians of the 19th century came from opposite sides of the religious divide. The Catholic Daniel O'Connell, who died in 1847, led a successful effort to repeal the law that barred Catholics from serving in political office. But he failed in his campaign to get the Act of Union repealed and restore the Irish Parliament. I'll say more about O'Connell's relationship to the Irish language and Irish history a bit later on. The Protestant Charles Stewart Parnell was an ardent Irish patriot who built on O'Connell's work by working towards the slightly less ambitious goal of achieving home rule for Ireland. Parnell came very close to achieving this goal, but he was brought down in 1890 by his adulterous relationship with a woman named Kitty O'Shea. Many public figures condemned Parnell, including the Catholic bishops of Ireland. The Parnell scandal split the constitutional nationalist community, and it was another 2 decades before home rule came to the top of the political agenda again. A far smaller and more radical fringe of the nationalist movement wanted not just home rule, but an absolute rupture of any ties to Great Britain, achieved by means of an armed struggle. I won't go into the details of the various doomed uprisings that these rebels engaged in, I just want to note that the name that they became known as was the Fenians, and this was a direct reference to the ancient Irish Fianna, the warrior band of Finn McCool. So although the Fenians did draw their legacy from the rebels of '98, who were not particularly interested in Irish literature, these new rebels were making an explicit nod to a specifically Gaelic Irish past. I've laid out these three political alternatives for Ireland because I think that knowing about this larger debate helps to set some of the cultural developments of the 19th century into context. People were really trying hard to figure out what it meant to be Irish, and how Irish identity could or could not be reconciled with British rule. Obviously, this identity crisis was largely confined to those who fell in one or the other of the nationalist camps. Unionists felt no anxiety about their identity since they saw themselves primarily as British. They were more anxious to be sure that Britain did not abandon them. But within the nationalist community, there were several main areas of emphasis. Some worked most intensively on political change, while others concentrated on trying to improve the economic situation for Irish farmers. Still others devoted their energies into a movement to shore up the Irishness of Ireland by preserving and reviving its distinctive cultural heritage. As I said at the outset of this lecture, this effort proceeded on several fronts, from athletics to language to literature to art. What's interesting here is that these efforts overlap with each other quite a bit. Many people were involved in more than one of these areas. Like the organizations that were founded in the late 18th century to revive the Celtic past of Wales and Scotland, these movements too sought to create an infrastructure that would support the Irish cultural revival. I'll talk about them roughly in the order in which these movements coalesced. The first of these organized movements was devoted to the revival of ancient Irish sports. So what were ancient Irish sports, and what claim do they have to being ancient? The one we have the most evidence for is hurling. In the Irish epic The Toyn, there are references to the hero Cuchulainn playing a game with the boy troop at the royal court of Ulster that involved striking a ball with a stick. He first demonstrates his heroic potential by beating all the other boys single-handed. So that's an impressive literary legacy for the sport of hurling. We also know that it was played in the Middle Ages because it was one of the Irish games that the English settlers were banned from playing under the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 as part of the effort to keep them from going native. We know less about the other main Irish sport that was revived in the 19th century, namely Gaelic football, which is sort of a cross between soccer and rugby. But there are references to football that go back as far as the 14th century. Both hurling and football were in decline by the middle of the 19th century due to competition from sports brought in from England, especially soccer and cricket. In response, the Gaelic Athletic Association, or GAA, was founded on November 1, 1884, by a teacher from County Clare named Michael Cusack in the billiard room at Hayes Hotel in Thurles, County Limerick. One of the other key sponsors of the new organization was Thomas William Croke, Archbishop of Cashel. Archbishop Croke was an ardent nationalist who had supported the Land League, which was a movement that was trying to obtain better conditions for Irish tenant farmers. He believed strongly in an Irish Ireland, and later supported the Irish language movement, which I'll talk about shortly. Here is what Archbishop Croke had to say about the decline of Irish sports. Indeed, if we continue traveling in the next score years and the direction that we have been going in for some time past, condemning the sports that were practiced by our forefathers, effacing our national features as though we were ashamed of them, and putting on, with England's stuffs and broadcloths, her masher habits, and such other effeminate follies as she may recommend, we had better at once, and publicly, abjure our nationality, clap hands for joy at the sight of the Union Jack, and place England's bloody red exultantly above the green. Wow. I'm going to jump ahead in the narrative for a moment to follow the story of Archbishop Croke. He was one of the casualties of the Parnell divorce scandal. After the scandal broke, he became disillusioned and withdrew from active politics. But he left a lasting legacy in the GAA. The GAA Stadium in Dublin, Croke Park, which is one of the 5 biggest stadiums in Europe, is named after him. Croke Park was the site of one of the most notorious episodes in the Irish War of Independence in 1920, when members of the British Special Troops known as the Black and Tans fired on the spectators at a Gaelic football match. The attack was launched in retaliation for a series of assassinations of British security officers that had taken place that morning under the orders of the Director of Intelligence for the Irish Republican Army, Michael Collins. The attack in Croke Park killed 14 civilians. There was clear symbolism in attacking a GAA match, because by this period, the GAA had become clearly identified with radical Irish republicanism. How had this happened? Well, starting with its foundation in 1884, the GAA became extremely popular with hundreds of clubs all around Ireland to foster the playing of the main Gaelic games, which, by the way, exist in both male and female varieties. And the female version of hurling is called camogie. The movement was strongly nationalist in flavor, and you could even be kicked out at first for playing cricket or any other foreign game. This emphasis on Gaelicization obviously dovetailed very clearly with a nationalist political agenda, and by the early 1900s, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the radical group associated with the Fenian legacy, had heavily infiltrated the GAA. This is not to say that all GAA members were Republicans, but many were. The next aspect of cultural nationalism I want to talk about is language. Ironically, there was an upsurge of interest in the Irish language in the late 19th century, just as it was largely dying out as a spoken language among the people of Ireland. There were many causes for the decline of Irish. One cause was the repeal of the penal laws. From the 17th century onward, legislation known as the penal laws had restricted economic and political opportunities for Catholics in both Britain and Ireland. But once it was legal for Catholics in Ireland to join the professions, there was a much greater incentive for them to learn English. Irish-speaking parents specifically sought out English instruction for their children to help them get ahead. The famous hedge schools, the informal schools in the Irish countryside that taught Catholic children who could not or would not attend official Protestant-run government schools, taught many subjects, including, in some cases, ancient Greek. But English was one of the most requested subjects. So part of the decline of Irish was due to the hard-headed decisions of many individual Irish people to adopt the linguistic habits of the ruling class. There was a more melancholy reason for the decline of Irish, of course, which was that a high percentage of Irish speakers fell victim to the Great Irish Potato Famine of the 1840s. The famine struck especially severely in the western part of Ireland, which was the more rural, less economically developed area, where the people were particularly dependent on the potato for subsistence. These were also the areas where Irish remained the everyday language of the peasant classes. When the potato blight hit, these subsistence farmers had very little to fall back on. The lucky ones emigrated, either to England or to North America or even to Australia. The unlucky ones did not survive. A map of the decline of spoken Irish tracks very closely with a map of the areas worst affected by the famine. Not all nationalists were dismayed by the decline of Irish. A prime example is Daniel O'Connell, who was raised speaking Irish in the western part of County Kerry, which is still part of the official Gaeltacht, or Irish-speaking region, to this day. O'Connell took a hard-headed approach to his native language. He said, "Although the Irish language is connected with many recollections that twine round the hearts of Irishmen, yet the superior utility of the English tongue as the medium of all modern communication is so great that I can witness, without a sigh, the gradual disuse of Irish." O'Connell was certainly very aware of his country's history and used it to his advantage for political purposes. He held his famous giant rallies in favor of repealing the Act of Union at sites around Ireland that were associated with past glories, such as the Hill of Tara, an ancient ritual assembly point. So the Irish past was important to him, but the language, not so much. O'Connell died in 1847, the worst year of the famine. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, Ireland was preoccupied with survival and recovery. It took another generation before a movement arose that would try to undo the linguistic damage caused by famine, emigration, and assimilation. The organization that took on that challenge was the Gaelic League, or Conradh na Gaeilge in Irish, which was founded in 1893 by three men: Father Eugene O'Growney, Owen MacNeill, and Douglas Hyde. Father O'Growney was a priest who grew up speaking no Irish at all, but he became interested in the language at school and began spending all his holidays in the west of Ireland among Irish speakers, and he later became a professor of Irish at the Catholic seminary at Maynooth. MacNeill was a great scholar of early Irish history, and he later played an interesting part in the Easter Rising of 1916, when members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and associated groups issued the Proclamation of the Republic and declared Ireland's independence. MacNeill had tried unsuccessfully to countermand the order to start the rebellion. Father O'Growney was obviously a Catholic, as was MacNeill, but Douglas Hyde was a Protestant from County Sligo. He was active in literary circles in both London and Dublin before he co-founded the League. Hyde was an ardent cultural nationalist. He gave a famous lecture in 1892 called The Necessity of De-Anglicizing Ireland. In my lecture on the Tudor conquest of Ireland, I talked about English efforts to Anglicize Ireland, and this effort had been partially successful. But as I said earlier, many of the Irish themselves saw it in their self-interest to learn English and abandon Irish. This is the phenomenon that Hyde is deploring in his speech, and he wanted to see the trend reversed. It's an interesting speech, actually quite subtle in its reasoning, and rather inclusive politically. In fact, he explicitly says that his point of view ought also to claim the sympathies of every intelligent unionist. He wasn't opposed to Irish people using English, as long as the Irish language and Irish literature were not neglected as a result. The aim of the League was primarily to revive the Irish language at all levels and to introduce it into the national curriculum. The League also campaigned, often successfully, for bilingual street signs and signposts. All over Ireland, there were people gathering together in local branches, learning Irish. At first, the membership of the League was primarily urban and bourgeois. The irony of this was that the League tended to romanticize the remaining Irish speakers of Ireland, the rural inhabitants of the West, whom most Gaelic League members did not know personally, as if there was something innately pure about their lifestyle. Douglas Hyde used to talk about the piety of the Irish Gael, who sees the hand of God in every place, in every time, in everything. Now, plenty of people thought that this was romantic nonsense. I want to quote an earlier reaction to this sort of sentiment by an Anglican clergyman named Sidney Smith, who thought that focusing on nationalism distracted people from their very real material problems. What trash to be bawling in the streets about the Green Isle, the Isle of the Ocean, the bold anthem of Erin Go Bragh. A far better anthem would be Erin Go Bread and Cheese, Erin Go Cabins that will keep out the rain, Erin Go Pantaloons without holes in them. But many people believed strongly in this essentially romantic notion of an Irish-speaking rural Ireland as some sort of ideal to aspire to, and it would have tremendous influence in the early years of Irish independence. The real importance of the Gaelic League is that it created this ideal of an Irish Ireland that was going to influence future nationalists very strongly. After a slow start, the League gained many more members after 1899 due to the outbreak of the Boer War between Britain and the Boer rebels in South Africa. Many Irishmen sided with the Boers, and they joined the League as an expression of anti-British partisanship. Still, the League was officially non-political for quite some time. The idea was that politics was going to follow language, and this was part of a larger movement in European life towards concentrating on cultural means of expressing nationalist aspirations. Political views within the Gaelic League varied. For many, the idea was that if Irish were revived, that would give a boost to Irish nationalism, a credibility that would aid in achieving independence, while other members did not aspire to Irish independence. This officially non-political stance was maintained until 1915, when the Gaelic League finally committed itself to independence, at which point Douglas Hyde resigned. Many of the participants in the Easter Rebellion of 1916 were members of the Gaelic League, and there was in fact some tension among the rebels between those who were competent in spoken Irish and those who weren't. By that point, the ability to speak Irish had become a marker of Irish nationalist credibility. There was another much broader approach to Gaelic revival as well. This focused not on the narrow linguistic question of whether the Irish language was being spoken, but on the actual literary heritage of Ireland, regardless of the language through which one might choose to encounter it. Most of the practitioners of this form of literary revival were members of the largely Protestant Anglo-Irish community. They sought their inspiration in Old Irish mythology and folklore. The Anglo-Irish literary figure, Augusta, Lady Gregory, for example, learned Old Irish, and in 1902 she published Cuchulainn of Merhevna, a well-received translation of the Táin. Lady Gregory does something very interesting with the text, however. She preserves most of the plot, but she takes out some of these stranger aspects of the original story. For example, Lady Gregory turns Cuchulainn into a conventional-looking hero. No more spiky hair and warp spasm. She also cuts out a lot of the more lurid passages having to do with sex. In short, Lady Gregory makes a hero who would be more acceptable to a 19th century bourgeois audience, and it was this normal-looking hero who was later immortalized in the famous Cuchulainn statue of 1911. This was later moved to the General Post Office in Dublin to commemorate the GPO's role as headquarters of the 1916 Rising. Still, it was very important to Lady Gregory and to her readers that she was presenting the authentic stories of the remote Irish Celtic past. The most famous name associated with the Gaelic literary revival is, of course, that of William Butler Yeats. Yeats used many Irish settings for his poems, and he often drew on specific Irish myths and tales. Just as Macpherson was inspired by the stories of Oisin in the 18th century, Yeats wrote a poem about Oisin, except he didn't claim that he had found it in an ancient manuscript. The idea is that Oisin has returned from the other world only to find that 300 years have gone by, and in the meantime, St. Patrick has arrived in Ireland. So Oisin tells the saint the story of his journey to the other world and his fairy love. Here is a brief excerpt. Sad to remember, sick with years, the swift innumerable spears, the horsemen with their floating hair, and bowls of barley, honey, and wine, those merry couples dancing in tune, on the white body that lay by mine. But the tale, though words be lighter than air, must live to be old like the wandering moon. Probably the most important works that the Gaelic revival produced were plays. Lady Gregory and Yeats co-founded the Irish Literary Theatre in 1899, later known as the Abbey Theatre, with the aim of producing Irish-themed plays. In their manifesto, they said, "We will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and of easy sentiment, as it has been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism. We are confident of the support of the Irish people who are weary of misrepresentation in carrying out a work that is outside all the political questions that divide us." There's a lot to unpack here. Clearly the audience for this is not purely Irish. These playwrights want an English audience to think well of Ireland. Also, you can definitely notice the scars of the recent struggles over home rule and the Parnell split. The idea is that literature can unite people rather than divide them. But just like with the Gaelic League, which was supposed to bridge the gap between nationalists of all stripes and even unionists, but ultimately was co-opted by the radical wing of nationalism, the literary movement ended up going in a very politically nationalist direction. A prime example of the intersection between politics and ancient Irish literature is Yeats's play Kathleen Ní Houlihan. The play was produced in 1902, shortly after the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 1798 Rising, and it went over very well with a nationalist audience in Dublin. It takes place in County Mayo in the west of Ireland, during the landing of the French forces in August 1798. The Gillane family is preparing for the marriage of their son Michael, when we meet a mysterious old woman, originally played by Maud Gunn, a famous actress who was Yeats's great unrequited love, and she was quite an actress. She is looking for the return of her 4 fields, which are, of course, the 4 provinces of Ireland. What she wants is for Michael Gillane to go off and fight with the French to liberate Ireland. And over the frantic objections of his family and his fiancée, he does just that. And once he leaves, the old woman is transformed into a beautiful woman who has the look of a queen. The old woman, of course, is specifically meant to call to mind the goddess of sovereignty of the old Irish tales. This was red meat stuff to a nationalist crowd. They loved it. Yeats had a somewhat troubled conscience about his play later, since a lot of people who were involved in the Easter Rising of 1916 had seen his play. In his poem, The Man and the Echo, written in 1938, he asks, "Did that play of mine send out certain men who English shot?" Not all of the plays produced at the Abbey Theatre drew so explicitly on mythological and historical themes, but they did confront the question of Irishness and Irish identity. The playwright John Millington Synge, a Protestant from County Dublin, knew the most Irish of any of these literary figures. He spent considerable time in the west of Ireland, especially in County Galway and on the Aran Islands, and he really got to know the people and the rhythms of their speech, which come out in his plays very forcefully. His most famous play is The Playboy of the Western World, first produced in 1907. It became infamous because one line in the play mentioned the word shift, a kind of woman's undergarment. When the crowd in the theater heard this word, which had become a kind of coded reference to Kitty O'Shea and the Parnell divorce scandal, they rioted. The relationship between politics and culture in Ireland was always a close one. So what does the Gaelic revival tell us about the relationship between Ireland's Celtic heritage and its modern culture? There are many continuities, of course, but in many cases, the modern revivals of ancient Irish literature have softened the edges of the original stories to make them more palatable to a modern audience. The Romanticism of the late 19th century was not comfortable with every aspect of the Celtic past. Yeats and Lady Gregory were happy to use ancient Irish stories when it suited them, but they also wanted to control the weirdness factor that came along with them. There is one final aspect to the Celtic revival that I want to touch on, and that is the fascination with Celtic art, which has somewhat different origins from the movements in sports, language, and literature, but they became intertwined. The Celtic art movement was largely inspired by the advances in literary scholarship and archaeology in the 19th century. Antiquarian scholars were translating ancient Irish manuscripts into English, in some cases for the first time, and the Book of Kells became a symbol of Irish cultural preeminence. In 1849, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited Ireland, they were asked to sign the Book of Kells. There were also the spectacular discoveries of the Tara brooch in 1850 and the Ardagh chalice in 1868, among others. These inspired contemporary jewelry and metalwork. As I mentioned in my lecture on Celtic art, Queen Victoria loved the Tara brooch so much that she had a copy to be given as gifts. At the same time, archaeologists were working out their theory of the origins of the Celts at Hallstatt and La Tène, so all of this art was seen as connecting Ireland to a great continental tradition. The greatest impact of the revival in Celtic art was in applied arts, such as book illustration and home furnishings, where we see a huge flowering of traditional Celtic motifs, such as geometric designs, knotwork, and interlaced animals. These Celtic motifs were also used prolifically in the printed materials put out by the Gaelic League and the GAA, as well as in the programs and posters of the Abbey Theatre. Irish cultural nationalism had a distinctively Celtic look. The Celtic revival in Ireland, then, was never divorced from the great political question of how Ireland was to be defined with regard to Britain. However much some important figures in the movement, such as Douglas Hyde, wanted to keep the questions of culture and politics separate, in Ireland they were as laced together as one of the motifs from the Book of Kells. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.